The last piece of input that we need to track from a user is the length of password that they want to have. We need to add one more event listener inside of here. We need to watch for whatever user types inside there, take that value, and store it as another property on our class, just like we saw on that diagram back over here. This is going to be very similar to all the checkboxes we put together. There's just going to be one very small difference. So with those different checkboxes, we were watching for an event called a change event. In the case of this input, we're going to watch for a slightly different type of event, an event called an input event. I want to give you a quick reminder on how we generally handle input events with normal JavaScript, and we'll take that knowledge and apply it to the world of Angular. So once again, I've got a very quick code snippet that I want to show you. So in this snippet, I've got a normal HTML element that is an input element. And then down here, I wrote out some JavaScript code to take a look and find that element. So I've got a reference to it right here. I then add on an event listener, and I watch for type input. That is the event I'm looking for. Then if I want to get the value out of that input, I take the event object that is provided anytime that event listener is triggered. And to actually read the value out of the input, we reference event.target.value. So in this case, I'm just taking that value and console logging it. So if I test out this application now, I've got a little console down here, and here's the input up here. I'll type in like 1, 2, 3, and every single time I press a key, I see an update down inside the console. Specifically, the value gets logged out. So 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. So that is the mechanism we're going to use, very similar for getting the value out of our text input. But we're going to be doing it in a kind of Angular fashion. Now before we go and write the Angular code, one other very quick thing I want to point out here, because this is going to be very relevant very quickly. Notice how if we enter in a number to this text input, it is provided to us as a string. So even though it looks to you and me like we entered a number, JavaScript is always going to treat the value of an input as a string. Like I said, that's going to be very relevant in just a moment. Okay, so let's go back over to our editor. We're going to add in an event handler to this input right here, and we're going to need to make sure that we kind of handle this same kind of idea of getting the event object and getting the value off the target property. So back inside of my editor, I'm going to go to my component template file. Here it is right here. I'm going to go up to the very top, and I'll find the input meant for managing the length of password. Then on there, I'm going to enter in a event handler binding. So remember, we put in the parentheses and then the name of the event. So in this case, we don't want the change event, which only gets triggered on a text input after a user finishes a change and then clicks out of the input. Instead, we want to watch for the input event. So we're going to put in the name right here of input. We'll then put in our equal sign and our double quotes. So just like we have on our other event handlers, we'll then add in a method to call right here. So let's try calling, how about a method named onChangeLength, and we'll call it like so. Now once again, this method is not defined. You and I have to define it ourselves on our component class. But first, we need to remember that anytime we receive this input event, if we want to get access to the value inside of that input, just like we saw over on this example, we have to get access to that event object. So in the world of Angular, that is just a little bit awkward. Remember, this right here gets evaluated as though it were code. So inside the kind of scope that we can kind of imagine exists inside of these double quotes, we get access to a very special variable called the event object. And it is identical to that event object over here. There's just one twist about it. In order to access that event object, we put in $event. So this is the same event object that we just saw back in that JavaScript example. The only difference is that we access it by putting $sign right in front of it. Now this doesn't mean that there's like some very special newfangled thing inside the world of JavaScript. Remember, $sign is a valid JavaScript identifier. So we can have a variable named $event. That is totally fine. It just turns out that the people behind Angular decided to make the event object available to us inside of this little area as a variable called $event. So now to actually get whatever the user entered in there, just like we saw in the JavaScript example, we will chain on .target.value. So now our method is going to be called with whatever the user just typed into that input. Okay, so let's save this file. We'll then go back over to our component class and we'll add in the onChangeLength method. So back over here, right above all of our other methods, I'll add in onChangeLength. So this is going to be called with whatever the user just entered into that text input. I'm going to receive that as a variable that I will call, how about value? Now when I type out value right there, I'm going to get a little kind of dot, dot, dot underline on it. That means that JavaScript, or technically TypeScript here, because that is what we are actually writing, is kind of complaining about what's going on. So we're going to add in just a little bit of additional syntax to this thing just to keep TypeScript from complaining. We'll discuss exactly what this additional syntax does in just a moment, along with a lot of other things inside this file. But for right now, let's just add the extra little bit of syntax on. So I'll say value, then colon, and string. All right, so now just like before, we need to declare a property that is going to store the length that the user just entered. So at the top, right next to all these other properties, I'm going to add in another property that we'll call length. And I'm going to initialize it with a value of 0. So then down inside of onChangeLength, we can take whatever value the user just entered into the input, and we can assign it to the length property. Just one thing. Remember, whenever a user types something into a text input, we receive it as a string. So value right here really is a string, and we don't want to assign a string to length. Length is supposed to be a number, indicating the number of characters inside the generated password. We just need to make sure that we parse that value variable right there and pull a number out of that string. So to do so, we will say const parsed value is parse int value. So now parsed value is an actual number. One other very small thing to be aware of here, if a user enters in just like some letters into that password input, then parsed value right here will come back to us as not a number. Let me show you what I mean really quickly. So I'm going to open up my terminal, and I'll put in parse int, and I'll just type in some letters like so. So if I run that, I get back not a number. So just to make sure that a user doesn't enter in some numbers like that right there, or letters like that right there, which would be very bad for our application, let's just do a really quick update, or a quick check inside here. We'll say if not is not a number. This is a built-in function inside of JavaScript to check to see if we are taking a look at not a number. We'll pass in parsed value. So if a user did not enter a number here, we're not going to enter the if statement. If they did enter a number, then we'll go inside. So if we're inside there, then we can take the parsed value and use it to update the length property. We'll say this.length is parsed value, like so. Okay, long video, I know, but we definitely got this on lockdown now, and hopefully you've got a really good idea of what's going on. I think that we've got just about all the data that we need to do our final password generation. So one more pause right here, and we'll take all of our information, the length, these flags, and so on, and then use it to generate our random password.